you remember, the banking industry tried this, right? They had this concept of the universal banker, and it went to where all great ideas go to die, which is to the back rooms of whatever consulting firm they're engaged in first creating the model. But there's some core principles there, because the idea is, look, my strategy as a business is to ensure my current and prospective customers have access to world-class solutions from me, while my sellers follow best-in-class or fair market practices. And fair market practices are driven by a good combination of those three things I mentioned: product, technical, customer-facing skills.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. Now, that was Gopkiran Rao, and Gop's the Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer at MindTickle. And in this episode, we start off by talking about why Gop believes that now it is more important than ever before for organizations to effectively and appropriately engage with their customers and prospects in conversation, not in sales cycles. And we explore what that means in terms of the business acumen and business agility that sellers need to possess to effectively engage in today's sales environment. Gop and I also dive into the whole topic of how to really elevate individual sales performance. And we also dig into what it means for sellers these days to be sales ready and what is required to help them become sales ready. So we get into this and much, much more. But before we get to Gop, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could also give us your feedback about how we're doing in the form of a review. So thank you. All right, let's jump into it. Gop, welcome to the show.
Andy, glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, it's a pleasure. It's been a while since we spoke.
Yeah, I was actually looking at some old emails and realized we last spoke in September of last year, when I think you were on the verge of your annual summer migration back to San Diego. So it has been a while.
Yeah. So where have you been sheltering during the pandemic?
Well, I'm quite fortunate. I find myself here in Twin Peaks in San Francisco, epicenter of what feels like
Nice.
tech valleys, coming to grips with this pandemic crisis. But fortunate to be here with the family, and in some strange ways, not being on a plane a lot of the time.
Yeah, I have that exact feeling. I've had this conversation. I've told people that I think I've been on a plane twice during the pandemic, and just going back and forth between New York and San Diego. But first time I was sort of paralyzed because I was so accustomed to packing a bag every week or every 2 weeks, and it'd been 3 months, and I didn't know what to do.
That's amazing. You do have to retrain yourself a little bit, I suppose, to not just surviving but thriving in this intensely physical yet virtual environment of whatever your living space is. And that's been interesting, I think, for so many people on so many fronts.
Well, so along those lines, what's the biggest lesson you've learned about yourself personally during the pandemic?
What a great question. I think the necessity of human contact, and yet the ability of the human to work around the inability to make human contact. And if that sounds like a play on words, I suppose I was trying to be clever there. But behind, that sentiment, Andy, I personally, just to answer your question more directly, have always thought that I did best when I was in a physical setting, in line with other people, and that somehow drove the creative process, collaborative communication, and a faster coming to of the decisions that made the wheels spin. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people that sort of prescribe to the analog model of operating, managing, right, producing. And I've been shocked by how quickly, because I was forced to pivot together with my immediate team and my extended team in what is, a very global company to begin with. The adjustments we've made have embraced a variety of, agile principles, have embraced this idea that work now happens in the flow of life and not the other way around, that micro communication and micro collaboration actually spurs more communication and creativity. And so the personal learning for me, I think, is that change, is is something that I've traditionally been comfortable with, but I think being able to adapt to this virtual environment has actually made me feel that a lot of things I thought about historically in terms of hiring, recruiting, decisions can actually, I can make those things work fairly well in a virtual remote environment. And on the flip side, I think it's really helped me understand the value of embracing kind of work that fits to people's life choices and necessities rather than the other way around. So those have been good things overall, I would say.
Well, it's a response to one of your comments, because this is something that I've read about. I've seen surveys with CEOs talking about this. Is that okay? We've learned that lessons about, as you talked about, micro communications and the ability to work remotely and collaborate in different ways and so on. It's working, but if it was such a good idea, why didn't we do it beforehand?
Look, I actually think
why.
No, it's a great question.
The technology has existed. Technology has existed for years.
I think the challenge has been traditionally we have approached technology as the end as opposed to the means. I think as with all technology decisions, we often confuse automation as the objective, as the outcome, as opposed to a better way of doing something, no matter what that might be, right? Whether it's email automation, or it is forecasting, or it is coaching our people, or even simply content management. And I think to a large extent, the ability to manage, to execute, to produce remotely, to your point, actually got well past the change event that needed to occur. And I think society, or corporate society in general, has been approaching it willy-nilly because of the events that required it. So, for example, we've always had remote sellers. And so I think sales management, for example, evolved to using these tools and other processes, including flying out and doing in-person offsites, or shadowing in person, or ride-alongs with managers, and then basically relied on the cell phone and Zoom and others for specific check-ins. Similarly, other teams, for example, healthcare has started embracing, remote monitoring services, telematics, telehealth, etc.
Right.
And I think in every sort of technology, maturity or evolution, there typically are these change events paired with change agents, and those change agents are either societal, external change agents, or internal change agents. And I think what we've seen is many companies like Google and Workday and others, and including many of our customers who frankly pivoted to this idea of asynchronous and ad hoc learning and sales training and coaching, were already starting to set the ways. And I think they were change agents for the rest of industry. And the pandemic, I think, was really a forcing function that has doubled up as a change agent and as a existential crisis for corporate companies. And the technology has just been there. Now I think we are faced with a second set of challenges, which is how do we prevent companies, or how do we help companies not simply to try and do a lift and shift of existing in-person processes to the in-person virtual world, as opposed to coming at this from a different way, which is how do we return value and time to our people while improving their productivity by changing the way we think about time management and workload management and workflow and so on. And I think that's what we're now poised off, next.
Yeah, I think, personally, I think this is a big deal, because you look at the vast majority of employees, this working remotely is not what they signed up for.
Right.
And work has a social component to it as well. And social, not just, I can have my micro communications, I can have spur of the moment collaborations. Technology enables these things. It's actually, it's proximity to people, not just. And so, there's things being written about this. I sort of sense it in some of the conversations I have for this show and so on, and other conversations, is people sort of just getting burned out by this thing. And some of it's obviously residual anxiety about the virus itself, but some of it is yeah, this is not sustainable, in part because I think a lot of corporations have, to a point you made, about the balance and the integration of work and life, is a lot of corporations have assumed, okay, you're not commuting an hour and a half each way twice a day. That now becomes work time. And I think we have this tendency with technology is to say, well, because we can do something, we should.
Yes.
Instead of looking at it saying, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should.
I mean, those are several very striking points you're making, and I'm just sort of trying to collate them in my head. I think this idea of the physical intimacy, which is so central to the human condition and drives commerce. I mean, ultimately, we're all in the business of doing business with other people. We should never forget that, which is why e-commerce, for all of its vaunted promise, will continue to be a tool that has its place, but will never replace, that interaction between a buyer and a seller. And the other point you make about this idea of exhaustion, I think is very real. It's very palpable. I personally, some days just don't want to, log into my computer because I'm simply picking up from where I left off. It feels like 5 minutes ago when I went to bed. And there's only so much you can do in terms of stand-ups and micro meetings and micro communications. And if I put all of those things together, look, I think what you're right. I don't think there's a short answer except to say we are in, I think, phase 2 of an evolution. I mean, someone famously talked to me about this a couple of days ago as sort of similar to going through the process of grief. Whether you prescribe it to the 5-stage process of dealing with grief or the 4-stage. I think we've gone through, the first couple of stages, and we are now between kind of reacting and adjusting. And part of the problem is, unlike with grief, where you have a specific event that occurs over a point of time, here, time itself seems to be stretching a little bit. So we don't quite know whether this thing will end next week or next year. So I think we are in this process of adjustment, acceptance, and we're all at different stages, depending on whether you're in the US or you're in India or in New Zealand or, maybe in Scandinavia. And I think that's what's going to actually stress the system more than anything else, because within our pockets, I think we will find good best practices starting to emerge. But those best practices may not apply equally for global companies that have presence in many different time zones and places, and where one is more, authoritarian in terms of who can meet who, when, and where. Others might be completely, open to it. And that'll create, I think, the next set of stresses that we're just starting to see now as companies embrace an all virtual or hybrid or all in-person model. So flexibility, I think, just to sort of close out my comment here, will be the key. I think standardization at a corporate level in terms of accessibility to tools, to resources, to budgets, and then a lot of autonomy and flexibility at a local level to try experiments, to do things that are right for you. Some of the same principles that apply to ERP systems, for example, certainly come into play, I think, in terms of employee engagement.
Yeah. Well, Mike, I guess one of my big fears is, and I've again read about this recently too, is that a lot of companies, especially public companies, finding that gosh, if we can shed some of this real estate, earnings become pretty attractive. And it's like, what's really driving these decisions, right? Is it
great point?
What is best for the employees and the productivity of the organization, or earnings per share?
That's a great point. I mean, it was interesting. In the first few weeks of the pandemic, I was tracking a lot of earnings calls, and you had, I remember, the CEO of Barclays, Mondelez, I believe it was another British bank, maybe even Standard Chartered, but they all came out within weeks of each other, essentially saying, look, we see, and the words they used were, kind of interesting: rationalization, consolidation, standardization, all ostensibly seemingly aimed on, the lower half of that balance sheet.
Innocuous.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it's wrapped in the theory that this is all about freeing up our employees to be productive no matter where they are. So I think it was a good, the messaging was a good balance of kind of empowering and cost cutting. But ultimately what it came down to was, hey, Mondelez, I'm going to have 500, 600,000 employees. able to work where they are. If I'm Barclays, I'm going to try and bring the number of global headquarters down to 2 because that's all we need really. And then you have, the next stage of companies, the Googles and the Facebooks jumping on it. And you have to think, absolutely, there are bean counters who are looking at the per employee, per square foot costs of continuing to keep things in operation.
Mm-hmm.
But, I also, a very good friend of mine is currently program managing, the Google. Maybe it's Google or one of the other big tech companies in the Bay Area, and they're just continuing to drive investments in physical space. So I think there's a sense that what goes around will eventually come around, and there will be hunger, for a sizable portion of the workforce to get back to that old normal. So we'll see. Yeah. Maybe that's what will happen.
More flexible, some hybrid model. I agree.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
All right, so let's talk about sales a little bit. You've said that it's now more important than ever for companies to engage their customers and prospects in conversation, not in sales cycles. So tell us what you meant by that.
Yeah. Look, if you look at the history of sales and, B2B sales in particular, the long-term struggle of presenting a buyer with a universal seller has almost usually resulted in a suboptimal experience. And by universal seller, I mean someone who can completely internalize all the best aspects of that company's culture, have supreme product knowledge, technical skills, and customer engagement and understanding. And so what they've sought to do is to complement, essentially a frontline seller with
the superhuman.
The superhuman. And if you remember, the banking industry tried this, right?
Yes.
They had this concept of the universal banker, and it went to where all great ideas poorly executed go to die, which is back to the back rooms of whatever consulting firm they're engaged in first creating the model. But there's some core principles there, because the idea is, look, my strategy as a business is to ensure my current and prospective customers have access to world-class solutions from me, while my sellers follow best-in-class of fair market practices. And fair market practices are driven by a good combination of those three things I mentioned: product, technical, customer-facing skills. If I can't, and so companies have two choices. They can create a system recognizing that no two humans are the same, and they won't come out of a production line looking and feeling the same. Therefore, it has to be personalized, it has to be role-specific, it has to be in the flow of work, etc., and create a system to enable sellers to engage with customers. Or, in addition to that, they can create a team around the sellers, a selling team, if you will. And this becomes particularly important in B2B because, as you know, buyers are now also creating buying teams. And while that's always been the case, there's Forrester research, for example, that says up to 9 people on the buyer side are now engaging up to 6 or 7 people on the seller side. And so what you've got is this perfect storm in an industry that's already complicated by consolidation and overseas competition and partners becoming competitors and move to new revenue models. And so you can't, the companies have been struggling for some time. This idea of there no being an out-of-the-box product, but that us needing to align requirements to buying processes means many sales motions. And that's where I think my thesis emerges, which is that you have to allow your sellers to operate within this ecosystem where you recognize them as unique people, but you maximize their battle of field-ready skills to be able to pivot and adjust. Because the hardcore muscles that are required in the field of play are a given. They've built, practiced, observed, remediated, and reinforced those skills, the ones that matter for their industry or their role, so well that what's left to do is really merely react to the 5, 10, 15% that is, specific to the circumstance in which they find themselves. And again, for every company and every industry and every product line, that's going to be different, that combination. In some cases, discovery and value selling are going to be a lot more important if you're in a, fairly complex solution type sell, versus if you're selling widgets, where process might be the key. Your ability to close a large transaction on a consistent basis, to write contracts, while minimizing your discounting giveaways, et cetera, might be important. And I think that's where companies have failed. And, in terms of understanding that, creating the ideal seller profile, building the system to help create and maintain the ideal seller profile, and then putting the wrapper of tools and processes and resources around them. And they go back to that same sin, and you and I were talking about, if you will, that original sin of sales, which is, let's just bring another tool in, because that'll somehow solve for the problem, and that creates, I think, exhaustion and cognitive noise. So that's sort of, I think, my principles on this topic.
So on top of that, though, this is building what you're talking about. Is I think we still have this fundamental problem, and I think it's made for me more acute and able to visualize it better. Is after Gartner put out their buyer enablement study a couple of years ago. And they have this famous diagram now of the buyer's journey, which they call the spaghetti diagram, which is this messy, recursive, spontaneous process to be able to make a decision about what they're going to do and who they're going to do it with. And I haven't seen anyone, any company that I've spoken to that has said, well, we need to change how we're sort of denominating our stages in our selling process to align with what the buyers are doing. And so, when you look at Gartner's study, they've got in that middle of that big diagram, they got 4 boxes, which they call the jobs buyers are trying to do, which is identify their problem, evaluate, potential solutions, finalize the requirements or build the requirements, and select a vendor. And I challenged people. I said, so tell me, okay, where in those 4 jobs does discovery take place? Where does qualification take place? Are they even relevant in the way we think about them relative to how the buyers perceive things? So we can have these sellers that we think are exquisitely trained, but we're sending them into an environment with a mindset that is completely orthogonal to the one the buyers have.
I think you're onto something very important, Andy, and I think you always have you and I have sort of talked about this in the past, absolutely. And I think what's ironic and perhaps interesting, and the reason, like you, I've recently come into some of this perspective myself is because I've been wearing the marketing hat at MindTickle for a couple of years now, in addition to the stuff, I'd actually signed up to do. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I've realized, yes, exactly. What I've realized is that marketing, ironically, I think has a little bit of a leg up on this situation of understanding and engaging the buyer across their journeys for 2 reasons. One is, as we've all now had drummed into our heads for some time now, buyers are increasingly well-researched, better educated, and a lot more prepared before they're willing, able, or ready to engage with a human on the other side. Whether that person is a BDR, a drift bot, or an AE, it's immaterial. Right. This therefore means marketing is developing not just a single ICP, but many micro ICP, ideal customer profiles for our audience, and flavors of personas within that. And is constantly tweaking and pushing out channels and content that sit at the many intersections of those micro personas and micro ICPs, and constantly using the data to refine and redevelop and republish and reengage those personas. And they have become, the more effective companies, the more effective marketers have become a key part of the buyer's education, because they're not pushing out product talk, they're pushing out insights. How are other companies like you dealing with this problem, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, we've all read the books in terms of how to do better content marketing. The second thing is, because the buyer's journey is now relatively well understood in terms of, whether you call it awareness to interest to evaluation to selection to, stewardship and, championship. I think marketing is able to leverage the same set of tools and a unified data model across the journey of that customer from awareness through renewal and expansion. And they now have, so now you've got the tools, you've got the profile, you've got the content, and you've got the data, and you've got the orchestration, therefore, of the ability to engage and impact these customers and other, entities within the buyer journey who may be undergoing their own journeys at different stages in their evolution. And so sales, I think a well-integrated sales and marketing organization understands that marketing's job is no longer this brute force generation of leads. It's really about partnering. This is truly about partnering, with sales. And this is where I think sales has the ability to also change the way to operate from being transaction drivers, which is, again, I think a principle that you and I had initially connected on. Again, no two transactions, no two people are the same. Sellers need to be able to understand and engage, much like with marketing into these. And that's where that universal seller model becomes attractive. Because in theory, someone who's perfectly, where where the generic stuff is muscle memory, and you can now focus purely on the EQ of, dealing with your mini persona, is when I think we will get to that next stage. And that is a little bit of an evolution. I don't think that's a revolution. But we'll have to go back to first principles. What will it take to succeed for a person in this role that's unique to my business? And how am I going to prepare him or her to get there, to not be a B player or a C player, but to be a orchestrated A player, not a lone wolf A player, if you will. And so that's sort of my thought process on this very important question you're raising.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great answer. I think that we still make it too complex, though.
Yes.
One of the insights that I had looking at the Gartner chart, if you will, is I sort of drew a line from the top to the bottom after the first three jobs that were sort of laid out, and I said, well, here's a problem: is to the left of the line, all those activities are completely focused on choosing how they're going to solve their problem.
Yeah.
And the one to the right, which is selecting a vendor, is about who we're going to do it with. But the way we train and focus sellers is, well, go deploy your persuasive skills to become selected as the vendor. But we're missing this whole point. Is like, well, customer still hasn't decided. They don't even know what the problem is yet, right?
Exactly.
They don't fully understand it. This is where your insights come in. This is where your great questions come in.
Yes.
And we know, and the way people make decisions is, and this is, they call it build requirements, but really what that step is the customer formulating options for how they're going to solve the problem. And so before they make a decision before they make the step, to go to select a vendor, they choose an option. How are we going to solve this problem?
Yeah.
And so we've got all of our sellers focused on becoming selected as the vendor when they really need to be focused on just being the answer to the question, how am I going to solve this problem?
That's right.
And I think during that, that whole front stage of the buying process, quite frankly, most buyers aren't focused on brands. They're focused on solution.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think methodology plays a big part in this too, because I do think, a lot of companies in tech in particular are in such a rush. I think part of the problem is, again, the objective. If you're unified, if your single overarching objective is to get to your quarter numbers and get to your valuation, whatever you've signed up for when you raised your last round, you're rarely in a position to go back to these basic first principles you're talking about, Andy, because every transaction is as good as the ACV or TCV it produces. And every seller is seen purely through the prism of the numbers, and no one's really focused on the customer. We all, everyone speaks about the customer, but the reality is that there's dispassionate conversation about things like churn and renewals and expansion overcome the fact that real people on the other side of your product need to be able to get up in the morning wanting to log in and leave at the end of the day feeling like they've accomplished something materially in your product, and that you have the data, the insight, the intelligence to help them do a better job when they come back the next day. And so I think it starts with that. Why do you exist as a business? What is your mission, your purpose? I think then it drives who you hire into sales. and into customer success. And are you bringing in problem solvers with domain who can do exactly what you're saying? If they don't know what questions to ask, help them with that. If they don't know how to solution, help them solution, and bring the right resources in to help them solution. Once they have a solution, ensure that they are in fact doing their part in terms of getting to those mutual KPIs that are built into your contract. Hopefully, in most cases, customers and sellers both miss a chance to do that, and then ultimately agree on whether it's in EBR or QBR that you will track to the success metrics you signed up, and all the criteria have been met. And I think very few companies are doing that because they're in such. And now with this crisis, this pain has become even worse because everyone's kind of looking at over their shoulders, but they're also trying to run full steam ahead. Not quite sure if they have a quarter or 2 quarters or 4 quarters to get to whatever new adjusted numbers they've put in place. And I think that's why this is such an amazing time for those of us that have the luxury of runways and customers supporting us. I think these are questions we should all be asking and trying to make changes, not just on the edges, but in the core operating rhythm of our businesses. So I'm sorry to wax a little philosophical, but I think you're really asking a very, very important question. Yeah.
Well, I think another question that's somewhat aligned with that is one that I ask a lot of people about and you sort of touched on it in something that you had sent me a few weeks ago before we spoke, is in preparation for this, is that talking about today's business environment, sales environment, business acumen, agility, really become paramount. You get a lot of people talking about now we have to lead with empathy, and I'm thinking, okay, these things have always been the case, right? We've always wanted to lead with empathy with our buyers. We didn't need a pandemic to tell us we need to lead with empathy, or acumen has always been valued as a differentiator, I think, for those sellers that tend to gravitate toward the more consistent high-level performance. I just find it interesting that we're now stressing these things as if they're new, and in this whole virtual selling world, it's like everybody's rushed to publish books about virtual selling. I'm thinking, but to be good at virtual selling, other than how you set up your background and eye contact in the camera, the fundamental sales behaviors that you'll succeed with are the same, right? I mean, I told someone this that had written one of these books. I said, "You realize, I asked him a question, when virtual selling started," and he was sort of thinking about it. I said, "Well, it was when Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone."
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, I understand that we got this moment, but it's like the basics, the fundamentals are still going to take you through. We still need to have our salespeople. Yeah, they need acumen. How are they going to get this acumen? This is the thing that business leaders, point out as the thing that's missing most, right? Why they don't value their interactions with sellers is they can't contribute to the deliberations.
I think that's exactly right, Andy, and I won't even try to dispute that. I mean, I suppose the only thing that has changed really is something you touched on at the outset, which is availability has decreased significantly because now you've got two people on both sides with very different operating environments. A seller with a dog and a child on the couch, buyer potentially. Racing between, a hospital or a telehealth, appointment because someone in the family was, just came down with a high fever, together with the fact that, everyone's working 12 hours a day and really doesn't want to be on another Zoom. So I think there's an added pressure here of optimizing digital engagement skills because your real estate has been reduced to the, 10 by 12 inch screen. And as I was saying to someone in a panel discussion the other day, look, back in the day, you and I had, when I say back in the day, it sounds like this was 20 years ago, but let's say even 12 months ago, you and I, when we first met, would greet each other at the front door. And then I would ask, I would ask about your commute, and it would give you a chance to potentially gripe about the terrible downtown San Francisco traffic. And then you and I would walk to the coffee machine, and you'd watch me make a fool of myself trying to make you an espresso. And these were all moments of shared kind of, sort of building, and so these are the kinds of things that I think we have to teach. And it's sort of part of, I think, engagement skills, and so on, that we don't have the luxury of now. Together with the pressure of these time zone differences and being at distance with poor internet connections and whatnot. So I think that
but
has. Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, but let me insert something though. There is that's I think a different point of view, which is that never, I'll say never, but just take that as what it is.
Yeah.
Is have we been in a situation as salespeople where we have such common shared experiences with every single person we're talking to? Because we have this global pandemic going on. So never has it been easier to establish common ground with someone you're speaking with.
Yeah, I suppose you're right. You're right. At a high level, yes, it is a unifying event. But I think within the event, there is so much disparity, which again, I think with the right social engagement skill, you should be able to use to your advantage as a seller, because it's a chance for you to be an active listener, to show empathy. Absolutely, Andy, absolutely. And I guess, yeah, you're right. So maybe my perspective was more from the perspective of things we've lost as opposed to things we've gained. And so there's a balancing act there for sure. And again, I think a human seller, a human first seller, I think will absolutely be able to pivot. But others will need to be taught. And that was, I guess, where I was coming from. Yes. I think perhaps you and I have higher, you have a higher EQ, which, allows you to do that. To do that, and I think that's generally the case with the distribution of sellers. I think there is some need for taught behavior and up-level skills that are unique to this environment. The second point, I think, now I'll answer the second question, which is why are many of these things that have always been needed suddenly become fashionable to talk about? It's because that's what we do. I think we like to take a few things and build on them. And, the race is really about who gets his or her Reader's Digest version of some universal truths out with some highfalutin terms in there. It's universal seen as a good thing. And, part of it is parading your likes and your, comments on LinkedIn or whatever, social channel of choice you have. So I think there's that. Then the third piece, I think, Andy, is the fact that I think companies and buyers and sellers are genuinely stressed about trying to make the right decision because everyone's being asked to do more with less. Everyone's basically concerned about the amount of runway they have. So this Pareto optimality that is required means that I, as a buyer, will have less time to do research, will have less time to meet with, to do RFIs and RFPs. And I'm probably going to be relying a lot more on things like my immediate community, my network, people within my organization, like customers like me. And these are the kinds of things that I think sellers need to be now retrained on because the environment has changed fundamentally again as a result of this pandemic in terms of time compression and availability of people who could spend time with you talking about work in a non-working environment, like going to a dinner or having drinks with you, especially if it was your coach or a champion, for example. And a lot of those things are fundamentally changing. So if your methodology was set up for the old ways where you had the executive bridging conversation in person, and you had the team demo, and you had the half-day workshop that involved the use of sticky notes. Those are all things that you've got to fundamentally pivot and reorient for this digital world in which no one's going to give you 4 hours in a Zoom session. Even QBRs, we personally have completely shifted from a lift and shift of a in-person VILT type QBR to be completely asynchronous. And the only time we spend now are in small sessions where sellers engage in groups and are sharing ideas with marketing and others. And those things are starting to work for us. I think that's where I would come from more. I think that's what's up-leveling some of this conversation and creating some urgency around traditional skills, but with new modalities and approaches to them.
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. I mean, but it's funny because I think that we got these sort of competing forces, right? That how they're responding to what's going on, and so some people will take what you've said, and there's a certain segment of people in the echo chamber that's LinkedIn saying, "Screw relationships," right? Customer doesn't have. You don't need to have a relationship with your customer. In fact, they don't need to think you're likable. And I've had a fairly long discussion with a guy on an episode of this show about that. And I think they're completely wrong. I think that actually we're going the other way. Yes, time is short. It's not going to be this way forever, we know. But at this moment in time, we do have this ability to create this common ground. We do have this ability to demonstrate, authentic empathy. And actually, I think a lot of sellers, and myself included, who spent our careers selling large, complex systems to very large companies, I never took a customer out to dinner. I mean, I was selling overseas. I was having these, what you'd say, executive bridging conversations on a telephone.
Yeah,
right. It's almost like it's Back to the Future again, because the people I know that were doing this really well never relied on those things, right? I always thought that the people that relied on golf and dinner and so on actually were compensating in some respects, or not being able to be more efficient, effective otherwise.
Yeah, and I think maybe one reason for that is because our social engagement has crept over into our business engagement, and by which I mean our reliance on Twitter and Facebook, and consuming everything in small videos and having things pushed to us via recommendations by some quote unquote smart machine or AI engine. I think what has changed, Andy, from in the time is not the first principles. I think people are still embracing the first principles. I think there's just an expectation, for example, that the way I should be trained, or that the way I deal with my customer should be similar to pushing 2 buttons on Amazon. I should be, the buyer has now been trained, and I think part of it is because there is a new generation that is increasingly in more and more important roles, buying roles. They're either key influencers or they're outright buyers. And a lot of these folks have been taught to expect that someone has already understood your desires and your needs and your ambitions, has looked at people just like you, in companies just like yours, and is able to now make recommendations, where your ability or need to do any kind of active thinking is limited to simply looking at 2 columns, comparing 2 products, and at a micro level, giving each other Harvey balls and telling you which one is better scored for your business. So there is, I think, this instant gratification satisfaction issue. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that everything is presented to me when I need it, before I know it. It comes to me by email, whatever my communication is, it's form factor optimized. 3, it's okay for me not to have to engage with a human, because the system, I can tell the system what I want, it will produce it for me. And if it doesn't, I'll simply Google it, and I'll find it. And I don't care about the fact that maybe someone is paid to have their search results higher, but I'm inherently going to trust it. And maybe if I have enough resources to delegate to, then I'll have them bring in the vendors and do some presentations. That's the problem on the buyer side. I think on the seller side, we have created this myth that sellers should expect everyone to basically orchestrate things, so that when the lead comes in, the lead is pre-qualified, and then the marketing and the BDR and the sales consulting team is going to kick in to qualify, challenge, or convert or evangelize. And then management is going to come in and make themselves available to do some of the things you talked about. Present the vision and mission, present the competitive differentiation, line up the investors and the big customer logos, and then have CS and PS show up to present how they're going to assemble a beautiful, high fidelity, high touch, relationship-based support model. And so part of the issue becomes, if I'm going to be able to get all these things done, why the heck am I going to spend my time doing some of the things you talked about? So I think the good sellers will do it. They don't want any of those things. They inherently understand, they control their destiny, and they are the hub of this, of the spokes. And this kind of brings us back to the basic issues. What is the answer? Is it methodology? Is it management philosophy? Is it process method? All of these things, and that's what differentiates leaders from laggards, in my opinion. So I think these conversations will continue for the next 20, 100 years. Who knows? But I don't think we'll ever solve it.
Wait, you mean we didn't solve it today?
Well, Andy, you put me and you in your room. I think we can solve a lot of things, but we don't do that enough. Yeah.
Well, but one point about your your point about changing generations and buyers and influencers and champions, so much, absolutely true, of course, is that I think the thing that people don't acknowledge enough, though, is that I've got a customer. I can sort of want to have this idea in my head that I want to make this like a transaction I take care of on Amazon, but assuming they can't because of a certain amount of complexity and contracts and yada yada. But the thing that is the great leveler is risk. It doesn't matter what generation you're in. If you're making a decision that encompasses some aspect of risk, whether for the organization or for the organization, then implicit in that is there's risk for you personally in the decision that you make. So what people want to do when there's risk is they want to mitigate that risk. And one of the ways that buyers mitigate risk is to talk to salespeople. And I think that this is, I think a lot of customers, people say, oh, yeah, your buyers don't want to talk to salespeople. Well, sure, who does? No one wants to talk to salespeople, but they have to. And there's been studies done on this already about, like in medical healthcare decisions that give people the choice between, hey, we got this AI-based algorithm that's gonna give you what your options are to treat this particular malady you have, and let's say it entails some sort of, let's say surgery, something that has risk and consequence, is that overwhelmingly people still want to talk to a doctor, even though the algorithm they believed generated more reliable responses to and guidance for what they should do. So I just don't think as long as people are involved in making these decisions, that risk is such a large structure or portion of the decision that it doesn't really matter the generation. People want to mitigate their personal risk as well.
Look, I think this is a fantastic point, and I mean, I'd like to sort of maybe share some data as way of sort of building on your point. And also, I think the maturity of industries comes into play. I think the healthcare industry in particular, values the word per minute ROI. Every doctor that spends time on filler words is going to see his average utilization rate drop because Medicare, or an insurance company is not paying him or her a lot for bedside manner. And so they've actually gone in the opposite direction of what we want, right? But every word is measured in terms of how does this directly impact my hospital's bottom line. In many other industries, I think the problem is the opposite. And the data for me comes from, one of the tools we've actually got. We call it, Call AI. It's a conversation intelligence platform. And when I look at the data in terms of, everything from word count per minute to the use of filler words, to the use of preambles, of rambles in conversation, it is absolutely shocking when you look at how extreme it is on the opposite end of the healthcare example we just talked about. And this is where I think your point becomes particularly key, because buyers absolutely want to talk to sellers. There is huge value in that person-to-person interaction, but not if the person's going to show up and ask them the same old tired questions, meeting after meeting, add no value, right? So I'm 100% aligned with you. And I think part was what has been, and this is what I think technology makes possible now. And I think a new data-driven culture, I think, is starting to embrace these tools a lot more. And then once you've done that, the second thing comes into play, Andy, which is another point you and I have talked about, is understanding what skills should have been displayed on that call. How much of that time should have been spent doing needs analysis or discovery, depending on the type of meeting it was meant to be. How much pre-work was done and presented on that call? Has the seller actively solicited next steps? Has he or she identified who else in the decision chain needs to be engaged in the next meeting? Have they closed the meeting with the next meeting scheduled or calendared? That's the kinds of things I think many companies and sellers have not known even to ask, or it's been stuck on a 10 by 12 inch page stuck on their wall somewhere that maybe they look at once every so often. And then their managers don't know to evaluate for that either. So I think the second piece now becomes, therefore, what are the skills that my sellers were required to demonstrate the behaviors? And having a way to measure them at that point in time, but also across points in time, across many calls for that customer, and correlating that to deal velocity, for example. And the third thing that we now emphasize is, okay, you've now got the data. Don't stop there. Don't just let them off with a wrist a slap on the wrist and a prayer and hope. Go back and actively reinforce or remediate those gaps. reinforce the good behaviors and remediate the gaps.
Right.
Because the attention span problem is a corresponding issue, and I think that's also where this next generation is I think going to start seeing some challenges. Because if you expect everything to be spoon-fed and micro-enabled and mobile optimized, that's not always going to be effective. But I think that's where technology and people will have to try to find that middle ground and hopefully get to solving the problem.
Yeah, and I think along with that is, I see one of the sort of outgrowths of all of this, as you're talking about, is that there's a fear of uncertainty. And sellers have this in spades, right? I think part of the reason sellers gravitate to scripted interactions and sort of a little more superficial, because they're selling to a persona, not to the person, right? Is that they're afraid to ask questions they don't know the answers to.
That's a really important
and I think that's
point.
And I think that's what we're training people to do is I've read the persona of this person I'm talking to. Okay, these are their concerns. This is generally how we expect them to answer these questions. And I think we need to train people to say, look, every time you're interacting with a buyer, and first of all, you should assume that every interaction, discovery is part of it.
Yeah.
Because you're always seeking to understand more.
Yep.
Because person with the most information wins. And it requires that you ask questions that, by definition, you don't know the answer to. And potentially that the buyer doesn't know the answer to, because then that causes them to think the question then becomes a commercial insight for the buyer.
Yes. I think this idea of essential sales competencies is something I think you've absolutely nailed there in terms of how you've talked about it. Agreed. Yeah. And it'll be, I think the universal skills amongst them are the key, the foundational skills, communication skills, willingness to learn, prospecting, however you define it.
Right.
Yes. Agreed, Andy, very much. And I think we've lost, I think we don't pay enough attention to that. You're right, absolutely. That's what makes, I think, an athlete, an all-rounder to some extent, when he or she needs to be, because they are grounded, in the basic running, throwing, lifting skills. At some basic level.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Right. So I created this acronym for those basic skills in sales. I think you master these 4, then you don't need anything else fundamentally, which is you have to learn the acronym is BALD, B-A-L-D. I can't remember if I told you this before. So B stands for be human, right? Can you connect with another human being? Can you build trust, credibility, and rapport? A, ask great questions. L, listen to understand. The thing that just escapes so many sellers is that one of the biggest sources of value you can provide to a buyer is to understand them and to make them feel understood. It's one of the things they hate about sellers, right? They didn't have value with that conversation with that salesperson because they just didn't get what we were talking about. Understanding becomes a critical source of value. So we got be human, ask great questions, listen to understand, and D, deliver great value. And that value comes in one of a variety of forms. Whether it's a question, it's data, it's content, it's case study, customer story, whatever. And it's just you have to do this every interaction. You practice this, and that's Someone told me it's sort of like I don't know if you've read that book, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. This woman talks about these are well, that's what this is. This is the equivalent in sales.
I love it. In the kitchen with Andy Paul. But it's, I think
in the kitchen.
Absolutely agree, Andy. I couldn't have expressed it better. And of course, on a personal level, I relate to BALD. So it's all very good.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, clearly you do. So, all right. Well, Gop, we're sort of running short on time. And as always, I didn't get to 90% of what I had planned to talk about. So we'll have you back and we'll do that.
I look forward to that very much, Andy. Thank you so much for having me on again.
And if people, it was a pleasure. If people want to contact you or connect with you, LinkedIn, place to go?
LinkedIn would be great. They can always find me also via email, gop@mindtickle.com. And I look forward to our next conversation.
All right. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. As always, we're so grateful for your support of this show. And I want to thank my guest, Gopkiran Rao, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you could also leave us a rating or a review and let us know how we're doing, well, we'd certainly appreciate it. And you can do all that on your phone in less than a minute as soon as this episode is over. So thank you for your help. And thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.